H&M Troop of the 7th U.S. Cavalry received orders to depart from Fort Rice and report to the headquarters of the 7th Cavalry at Fort Lincoln, Dakota. Upon arrival, we set up camp alongside the regiment. Just a few days into our stay, hostile scouts approached our camp, signaling their declaration of war. Consequently, the 7th Cavalry was directed to take action against them. Although the regiment had not planned to leave Fort Lincoln so soon, we broke camp on May 17th, accompanied by approximately 25 to 30 wagons. The steamer Far West was enlisted to transport provisions and ordnance stores and to evacuate any wounded soldiers in the event of battle. The regiment traveled through Bismarck, Dakota at 10 a.m. with Mrs. George A. Custer and the U.S. Paymaster in tow. Upon reaching Heart River, the paymaster distributed pay to the regiment. This precaution was taken to prevent most of the soldiers from remaining behind in Bismarck, possibly intoxicated. The regiment began constructing a pontoon bridge to facilitate crossing the wagon train over the Heart River. However, progress was hindered by a heavy rainstorm, slowing our movement across the muddy hills of Dakota. As a result, the regiment did not reach the Little Missouri River until the end of May, delayed further by a snowstorm that persisted through the night. Camp was established there until the 4th of June, when we broke camp and settled in a dry campsite between the Little Missouri and Powder River. Boots and saddles were sounded bright and early on the morning of June 5th, and we reached Powder River by the evening of the 7th. There, General Terry stumbled upon an Indian trail. Terry dispatched his scouts to track the trail, and upon their return, they reported that the Indians were headed towards the Little Bighorn. Terry decided to leave his wagon train at Powder River and proceeded with his pack train, leaving behind any men unable to endure the journey, along with a guard for the wagon train. The total number of men, including trumpeters, was approximately 100. The column proceeded gradually along the Yellowstone River, and upon reaching Tongue River around June 16th, we encountered some Indian burial sites erected on platforms supported by stakes and nestled in tree branches. The 7th Cavalry dismantled these graves and discarded them into Tongue River. It was a thoughtless decision to disturb the deceased, especially since I drank water from a spot just 100 yards downstream. One Indian remained lodged in a tree crotch and did not tumble into the river. Since we didn't make camp there, the column continued its slow advance up the Yellowstone River, with scouts deployed to prevent potential ambushes by Indians. I must note the distressing sight of a decomposed papoose lying at the base of one of these trees, likely fallen from one of the graves. After a few days, we arrived at Rosebud Creek. There, we encountered the steamer Far West docked, along with Colonel Gibbon and 4 troops of the 7th Cavalry and the 7th Infantry. It was at Rosebud where Custer received his instructions. He was directed to distribute 12 pounds of oats and 2 horseshoes, one for the forefoot and one for the hindfoot, to each man to be carried on his horse. Custer was also tasked with sending word to Terry at the mouth of the Little Bighorn via a scout once he had located the Indian village. On June 24th, Custer departed from the mouth of Rosebud Creek. While marching along the Rosebud, we passed several abandoned camps where the Native Americans had gathered before heading to Little Bighorn. We marched continuously, day and night, pausing only briefly at midnight to rest and tend to our horses. On the morning of the 25th, we were supplied with more ammunition. It was then that Mitch Bouye, the half-breed scout, returned with news that the village contained between 8,000 to 10,000 inhabitants. Despite Bouye's warning, Custer disregarded the information. It was common knowledge that Custer would proceed with his plan, with Bouye offering to guide him despite knowing the potential consequences. However, Custer was not one to be swayed or have his plans dictated by others, keeping his strategies closely guarded. On June 25th, Custer continued his march to within 5 miles of the Little Bighorn and then stopped. Custer instructed Major Reno, although he actually meant Benteen, on the next steps. He directed Reno to stay close behind with the rest of the troops and the pack train, while he himself would proceed with his 5 troops. Custer brought Mrs. Custer's horse Sadie along to ensure he had a fresh horse for the impending battle. With a swift start, Custer dashed ahead. Reno veered off Custer's path and lost his way in the hills. When he emerged from the hills, trumpeter John Martin handed him a dispatch urging him to hurry back with the packs, reporting a large village. Strangely, Reno didn't follow Custer's trail but instead diverged 4 miles up the Little Horn River, to the left of the village. Upon reaching the bluffs overlooking the river, Reno attempted to descend towards Custer, but the overwhelming presence of Indians between them made it clear he was surrounded. Benteen advised Reno to retreat and gather the pack train in the ravine. At this point, Custer was already engaged in the battle. He initiated his charge around 2:30 p.m. Reno's charge followed at about 3 o'clock. After crossing the river, Reno encountered a large number of Indians emerging from the woods. His men were to get off their horses and battle on foot. When he attempted to remount his men, they panicked and retreated to the river ford where they had crossed earlier. Meanwhile, the Indians were picking off Reno's men from their saddles. Reno suffered heavy casualties during this charge in the valley. After retreating back to the hills, H Troop occupied one bluff while the other troops held positions at the rear of nearby hills. It didn't take long for Reno's forces to be surrounded before the Indians launched a series of charges on H Troop's position. Their objective was to seize the hill held by H Troop, which, if successful, would have resulted in the massacre of Reno's entire command. Despite making 3 or 4 charges, the Indians failed to capture the hill. The final assault was so intense that Benteen had to request reinforcements from Reno. M Troop came to Benteen's aid and successfully repelled the Indians. Whenever we had a moment, we dug holes in the ground to conceal our heads, as we were unable to find picks or shovels during the fight. Our butcher knives became makeshift tools. Despite our limited numbers, we managed to fend off the Indians' overwhelming force. When Custer's command was wiped out, every Indian turned their attention to Reno's men. H Troop ran out of ammunition while positioned on the hill. Each man looked at the other, waiting for someone to volunteer to go down into the ravine where the pack train was located to retrieve more ammunition. Seeing that no one was willing to go, I and a fellow soldier named Jones decided to go down and fetch a box. Unfortunately, Jones was killed during the mission. Unable to carry a box of carbine ammunition, I grabbed a box of pistol cartridges instead. As I made my way back up the hill from the ravine, a bullet struck the box I was carrying, hitting it 3 or 4 times. I fell to the ground, pretending to be dead, hoping to deceive the Indians. Benteen instructed some men to run down the hill and retrieve the box I had been carrying. In a low voice, I assured them that I was just resting and would be there in a minute or so. As I reached the top of the hill, the Indians launched another fierce charge. It was this assault that nearly forced H Troop off the hill. This occurred on the evening of the 25th. The charge the following morning, on the 26th, wasn't as severe. I felt sympathy for the wounded soldiers lying among the pack train, shot down while protecting the injured. They were desperate for water. To alleviate their thirst temporarily, we opened boxes of tomatoes and other fruits, typically reserved for officers, and gave them to the wounded. Meanwhile, a water party was formed to fetch water for the wounded, guarded by a firing party along the ridge. Captain Benteen ordered that only the wounded be given water and instructed every man to fetch his own. We managed to keep the Indians at bay throughout the entire day on the 26th. Things calmed down at night. Madden from D Troop lost his leg on the evening of the 25th, or afternoon on the 26th, atop the hill. There wasn't much Indian gunfire on the morning of the 27th. It appeared to me that if Terry had been as bold as Custer, he could have arrived on the 26th instead of waiting until the 27th, given that Terry only had 20 miles to cover. However, when Terry reached Reno, he inquired about General Custer's whereabouts. Reno responded that he didn't know, mentioning that the last he had heard from Custer's men was gunfire downstream at sundown on the evening of the 25th. It seems Terry passed through Custer's battleground as he instructed Reno to gather all the picks and shovels and bury the fallen soldiers from Custer's tragic command. Terry attended to Reno's wounded while Reno was sorting out Custer's deceased. From the positions of the bodies when they were discovered, it seemed to me that it was a continuous skirmish, as the fallen soldiers appeared to have been engaged in a moving battle. Unfortunately, there are no photographs depicting the arrangement of the bodies on the ridge, as we had no photographer present and the reporter was killed. Only a rough sketch of the battle involving Custer's men can be provided by those who assisted in burying the deceased. I will provide the historian with comprehensive details regarding Custer's fallen soldiers. It appears that Custer's men never made it across the river. Although we discovered a trail leading down to the river, there was no evidence of Custer's presence on the other side, suggesting they were pushed back before crossing. The first bodies we found were on the ridge. Chief Trumpeter was on a small knoll with 3 arrows in his head and 1 in his right shoulder. Nearby lay Mark Kellogg, the New York reporter, with arrows in his body. Following them were several horses and their riders, most of whom were mutilated and pierced with arrows. Further up the ridge, we came across scattered soldiers and their horses. Thomas Tweed from L Troop, whom I enlisted with, was found with severe injuries, including arrows in his face, although he wasn't scalped. They didn't have time to scalp all the fallen, as there were around 280 killed on the ridge. Tweed didn't have a horse with him, but we found a wounded but alive horse nearby. Further up the ridge, at its summit, Captain Benteen rode ahead. After inspecting the ravine, he turned to Major Reno and declared, "Here is the entire headquarters." We discovered parts of C Troop and E Troop, as well as the remains of General Custer, Captain T. Custer, Captain Keogh, Captain Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, and possibly Captain Yates, though I'm not certain about Yates. Lieutenant Sturgis's trousers were found, although his body was not located at that time. Custer's nephew, around 18 years old, was also among the casualties. The units with Custer included C, E, F, I, and L troops. Captain Keogh and Sturgis were members of M Troop, but were with E Troop when they perished. Lieutenant DeRudio, an Italian officer who held a commission in the 7th Cavalry, managed to escape from Custer's command. It's likely he crossed the river, as he appeared from the timber and reached Reno's command on the 26th. After burying Custer's men, we crossed the river where the Indian village had been. There we discovered 2 heads of men who had been captured from Major Reno's command during Reno's charge on the evening of the 25th. It's likely they were taken on the 25th because we heard the commotion in the village. One of the heads was identified as belonging to John E. Armstrong of A Troop, 7th Cavalry. Captain Moylan of A Troop confirmed Armstrong's identity. Armstrong was a member of Moylan's troop, which was under Reno's command. We buried the 2 heads and then proceeded up the river to General Terry's camp to arrange transportation for our wounded to the mouth of the Little Bighorn, where they could board the steamer Far West. We gathered Indian lodge poles that were left behind and also cut some poles from the nearby timber to construct stretchers. Rations were distributed to facilitate unloading Colonel Gibbon's pack mules. We positioned a mule at the front and rear of each stretcher and attached the poles to the mules. Then we placed the wounded on the stretchers. Soldiers from the 7th Infantry marched alongside each stretcher to keep them steady. It took nearly the entire night to reach the mouth of the Little Bighorn. Unfortunately, some of the wounded passed away during the journey, even after they were placed on board the steamer. The unit departed for the mouth of the Bighorn River, where we waited a few days to receive word from General Crook. News arrived that Crook was camped over on the Rosebud Creek. Terry immediately packed up and moved the camp to join Crook. They held a council to determine their next course of action. It was agreed to go to the Powder River, where the 7th Cavalry had abandoned their wagon train, rather than continue on the Indian Road. Upon reaching Powder River, we discovered that the wagons had been destroyed, with grain scattered across the ground and the escorts all killed. After burying the deceased, General Terry and Crook went their separate ways. Terry headed to Fort Lincoln to recruit replacements for the 5 lost troops from June 25, 1876. Crook proceeded to disarm the Indians by going down to the lower agencies. Once the 7th Cavalry was replenished, they traveled down the river to the Standing Rock Agency to disarm the Indians there. We searched through their lodges, dismantling their gear and driving off their ponies. After completing this task, we returned to our headquarters at Fort Lincoln, Dakota. General Custer has faced significant criticism for the failure of this campaign, and it appears warranted. He disregarded orders by failing to notify General Terry when he located the Indian village, and by initiating the battle on the 25th instead of waiting until the 26th. Additionally, he neglected to bring the Gatling guns and the 4 troops of the 2nd Cavalry, as instructed. The original plan of the campaign was for Custer to advance up the Rosebud, while Terry moved up the Little Horn River with Crook approaching from the rear of the Indians, forming a coordinated attack. Had this plan been executed, victory would likely have been achieved.